Welcome to our lesson discussing the rhetorical analysis of an open letter. In this lesson, we will dive deeper into the Aristotelian appeals and rhetorical situation. I'm going to do that by using Martin Luther King Jr.'s open letter from Birmingham jail, which was originally published in 1963. And you should have already read this. It was in that mental floss article that I had you guys read. So I know it's long, but it's very important to read a full text to understand the rhetorical situation and the strategies or appeals used to appeal to the audience. Okay, so applying lesson 2, which was what is rhetoric. So at this point, you should have read the Mental Floss article, 6 Open Letters That Changed the World by Chris Higgins, and MLK's open letter. If you haven't read it yet, please do that now and then come back so we can actually work through this together. Okay. So this lesson applies the rhetorical tools and appeals we learned in lesson 2. We will use Martin Luther King Jr.'s open letter as an example. So if we break it down, remember we are looking for the audience, speaker, purpose, ethos, pathos, and logos. For this lesson, we are only focused on identifying the rhetorical tools. We'll get more into it later on in the semester. You'll see. You just wait. All right, so let's talk about the audience. So MLK addresses his audience at the beginning of the letter. He says, "My dear fellow clergymen," in all caps, no less. However, is there another audience he doesn't mention? This very long letter was published in the media, newspapers, magazines, and in MLK's book, Why We Can't Wait. So the audience was broader than his fellow clergymen. He aimed this letter at desegregation supporters, I think is what I was going for, activists, segregation participants, etc. So when analyzing a text for the audience, you must look beyond the obvious and think critically about the text's purpose. So where it's, especially with an open letter, it's obvious they address it. They say, "Dear this person," or "this group," or, whatever, what have you. And so yes, obviously that is one audience, but we have to think about where this letter will be seen, who will see it. Is this intended by the author? Most likely yes, so on and so forth. All right, as far as purpose goes, so what prompted MLK to write this letter? Well, an open letter from white anti-segregation clergymen in the South worked toward the end of segregation like MLK, but they wanted to infiltrate the legal system instead of holding peaceful demonstrations like MLK was doing. They didn't think that was a good idea. And although they were on, quote unquote, the same side as MLK, they still took it upon themselves to tell him that it wasn't a great idea to do what he was doing. So MLK's letter is a response. And a particular quote presents MLK's purpose rather beautifully. He says, "I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And I'm sure you may have heard that because it is a very famous quote, and it is also just so powerful, and anyway, very good. So then he responds to his fellow clergymen, because we had no quote, "We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community," end quote. So he doesn't list, but he includes many instances of purpose, rhetorical purpose in his letter. And these are just a few small ones that I picked out when I was reading through. So definitely look for more, because there are so many. All right, pathos. So pathos is the emotional appeal. What part of this letter evokes emotion, fear, anger, joy, sadness? One quote that struck me was, "We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail?" So for that to me made me afraid of being in a situation like that. It made me think about sympathetically and empathetically to the people that were put in that situation. And it really, it sparked an entire worry and anxiety for me, you know, thinking about the injustice of it all. Anyway, so it evoked a very real emotion in me. I actually stopped and said, wow, afterwards. But these instances may strike a different emotion in each individual. However, they still strike emotion. So I do mention another one here, and it's also so powerful. You know, this weight has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. And so he really makes a very strong argument for why he was holding these demonstrations. And this class isn't to talk about how, you know, amazing Martin Luther King Jr. was and how the civil rights movement worked rhetorically in this country. It's not necessarily about that, but I think personally that he did a very good job of relaying his message and convincing me, for sure, not that I needed convincing, but convincing me that, yeah, he should be doing these demonstrations. So that's one way to approach the rhetorical situation and realize the strategies used by the author is to think, you know, does this change your mind? Does this make you feel a certain way? You know, you can ask yourself these questions and usually come to a pretty good understanding of what they're doing to cause those questions. All right, so ethos. Ethos refers to credibility, remember. How does MLK establish credibility in this letter? Why should his audience trust what he says? So the following quotes are examples of his ethos that I found. So it says, if I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. So I think that this shows his ethos by saying, first, including that he is has a desk in an office somewhere. He has a secretary, and he doesn't have very much time to sit and respond to criticism all the time, you know. So I think that alone says that he's an important somebody, right? And then the second quote I like is, I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need for nonviolent I don't know what I was going with that, to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So to me, him using Socrates, bringing in all of these ideals shows that he's very educated. You know, he knows what he's talking about. He can draw on philosophers and past concepts that would place him in a scholarship, you know, of it just makes him seem very intelligent to me. And that's on a very basic level. So these examples could also incorporate pathos and logos, and that's important to notice. The intertwining of the appeals can lead to a more cohesive text. It is important to be on the lookout for these moments. All right, logos is the logic appeal. Remember that from our previous lesson. So this device leans on reasoning. A clear understanding or breakdown can help the audience understand your purpose. So MLK utilizes logos quite a bit in his open letter, particularly breaking down any nonviolent campaign in 4 basic steps, helps his audience understand his motivation, and gives reason to the demonstrations. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps, he says: collection of the facts to determine whether injustice exists, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. MLK also offers multiple examples and explanations to clarify his meaning. This approach uses reason to level with his audience. He says, let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. So his breakdown, him saying first, I'm going to break this down for you, and then breaking it down, that appeals logically to his audience because they now understand exactly what he's trying to say. It makes sense, at least he lays it out to make sense to the audience, and it's a very powerful thing. You don't want to patronize technically, or maybe you do, but it might not be the greatest idea to patronize your audience. So don't make them seem like they're dumb or they're not intelligent enough to understand what you're talking about. And MLK does not do that here. He's like, hey, this is what I'm going to say. Let's consider a more concrete example. And then he says, all right, here's an unjust law, and then here's a just law. But I think that that's important for people to realize his argument, and it helps his rhetorical situation greatly. To summarize, in short, Martin Luther King's open letter from a Birmingham jail, utilizes the rhetorical appeals like a pro. He weaves them into his text, creating a blanket of rhetoric. The examples I've shared only touch on his use of the appeals. I mean, it's saturated, and it's beautiful to see it all unwind. Now that we have gone through an open letter analysis together, it is your turn to give it a try. For your short assignment this week, pick an open letter and first locate the speaker, audience, and purpose. Then, using direct quotes, find places in the text where the author utilizes ethos, logos, and pathos. And you can refer to the assignment sheet for more clarity on that, or you can ask me. So, as always, reach out to me with any questions or visit me during office hours.